Well, Kashmiri translations begin with sort of the adaptations of Persian classics, like the Shahnama, for instance, is translated. This is the late 18th century that this starts, the 1770, 1780, and so on. And in part, it's part of the sort of larger turn towards regional vernaculars all across the Indian subcontinent. In the wake of the decline of the Mughal Empire, this is the moment when that begins to happen, and with some differences in Kashmir, but nonetheless it kind of applies. And then through the course of the 19th century, it becomes far more. It becomes not just about translating Persian classics, but it becomes about translating Persian texts from Kashmir as well, and then it becomes about translating, or not just translating or adapting, but in fact writing original Kashmiri mystical texts and stories and poems. By the way, all of this is Kashmiri is largely a poetic tradition, so there's very little prose translation going on in this. And poetry, of course, lends itself in many ways to kind of the oral performance and so on. But then, again, in the case of Kashmir, you have to think about sort of formal performances like storytelling, gatherings and so on, but also just older women in particular. For instance, my grandmother would recite some of these things and sing them. She was completely illiterate, but so that's one of the ways that it also gets kind of transmitted as well.
I have a question. So how do you strike a balance between these parallel oral and written traditions as a historian? So you have, I'm sure you've many challenges in
yes
in balancing the two. So how do you do that as a historian?
Primarily my book is based on the textual traditions, clearly, because it's I have to produce evidence for what I'm writing. So. But I have a fair amount of the book is in fact about seeing how there's a symbiosis between the two. So what I really deal with is intertextuality. In other words, how do these stories sort of circulate. And I know are interested in sort of folk tales and things like that. But you can see those circulating as well in this, and they're drawn many times from specific sort of historical figures or historical incidents and things like that. So it's very hard to kind of not so much a balance, but really to kind of see, how they interact with each other, and then and this is a question that was asked in the back, how they actually get transmitted then, and how do you kind of prove that? And Nilesh was asking me this in the beginning of the, before I gave the paper, we were talking about this as well, how to find sort of some kind of a theoretical mode to talk about performance as a way of thinking about the past, really, which is difficult to do.
Yeah, because sometimes you have the same story with so many different versions.
But absolutely, that's what all of these stories that I've talked about. I almost trace them. I travel with the stories through the book to see how they kind of take on different meanings and depending on obviously on the context and the author and what they're trying to say at a particular moment and so on. So there's a slight variation in the stories. And the thing about performance, of course, is that performance can take a shape at the particular moment that it's done. So there's no it changes every time a story is performed. So for instance, the story of Himal Nagare, which I'm sure there are all these Kashmiris here in the room, and they all know. It was told to me, I heard it twice or thrice by storytellers in the Kashmir Valley in the past couple of years. And every time it was told, it assumed different form. At one point, realizing that I was a Kashmiri Pandit, it became a story about Himal being a Kashmiri Pandit and Nagara being a Muslim, and they were, lovers and so on. So, again, clearly sort of depending on the moment, the stories, take on different meaning. And but then, how does one use that to really talk about the past is the big question. So, at least from my perspective.
In that respect, maybe poetic traditions are more consistent. I don't know. Do you think so?
Poetic traditions
in terms of what the content is, right?
Well, the way it moves from text to orality to performance, first of all, I don't think it necessarily moves this way because there's a kind of circularity in movement. But, if there's a Persian text, it's translated into Kashmiri or adapted into Kashmiri, it becomes totally different. But then there has to be Kashmiri poetry that, the storytellers, for instance, told me that we can't perform anything that's not first a Kashmiri poem, and then we will adapt it and perform it in different ways depending on the audience, and and make it as exciting as the amount of money that the audience gives us. Basically, I was also told. So I mean, they said we just stop if the money is not being forked out. We just stop and we're like, okay, this is boring audience. So people start paying up, and then the story becomes more exciting. So.
Yeah.
And my question to you, Lekha, is, obviously the idea of Kashmir is very compelling. At least it's for the Kashmiris, it's very compelling. But my question to you is, has anybody looked broader in the context of South Asia, where there is, in a sense, a civilizational state and a lot of locations of spirituality and sanctity, and do we have a similar situation there also? The idea of such as X, sacred place X, and that sanctity takes place, has an historical context in those areas, or is the Kashmir situation uniquely different from other in the subcontinent?
I mean, the way it plays out is obviously different because the context is different. But there's a number of traditions in the UP, in Bengal, and so on that also describe these places as sacred spaces. One of the things that is interesting is really to look at whether these traditions are continuous, like the Kashmiri one is, or whether there are ruptures, and why in the case of Kashmir there is or isn't a rupture in the way that there is. So, for instance, traditions in the UP, there's a clear rupture in the 18th century where the sort of sacred traditions suddenly are no longer. I mean, the place is no longer paradise on earth, and it becomes something different. But Kashmir is certainly not unique in terms of describing certain regions as sacred spaces. Tamil poetry is talking about the Tamil Nadu as being sacred in several hundred years only before Kashmir. So.
Any idea how the current curriculum in the schools and higher education looks at the history, especially in terms of tension between Hindus and Muslims?
Kashmir, like everywhere else in India, has the same sort of textbooks. The National Council on Educational Research and Training textbooks. So it's a very nationalist narrative that you get. In fact, I've always found it. It's kind of mind-boggling because I've spent a lot of time at the University of Kashmir. In fact, I stay there whenever I'm in Kashmir doing research and so on. And I meet students, and they've never been taught anything about the history of Kashmir at all. And in schools and things. The first time that they encounter it is in the university if they choose to take history courses and things like that. So, and then of course there's that. And then there's this popular kind of discourse in Kashmir that is constantly touting history in one way or another. The most famous sort of cliche, of course, being that Kashmir has been enslaved since the Mughals conquered it in the late 16th century and so on. So again, there are these ideologically driven ideas about history, history as slogan basically that they understand or that people engage with. But they've never actually been, taught the history of Kashmir. And this is like anywhere else in the Indian subcontinent.
Basically the mainstream historical.
Yeah, the narrative, that you get. In 1975, Sheikh Abdullah decided that he was going to introduce Kashmir's history to the Kashmiri school curriculum, and he actually deputed someone to write a textbook of the history of Kashmir. But that, obviously that fell through for other reasons. Sheikh Abdullah himself was no longer. But Sheikh Abdullah realized from the 1950s onwards that if you were if you wanted to, especially for his regime, he was trying to kind of get behind this ideology of Kashmiriyat and see how it fits with India and so on, that you needed to teach a certain version of Kashmir's history in schools, but it never really kind of took off. It's not in the school system. I mean, beyond Kashmir's history, Kashmiri is not a language that has ever been, taught in Kashmiri schools. There's of course also a movement to do that now, as well. So, yeah. Yeah, and exactly. So there's small pockets in which that's.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.